have to get wired appropriately, so give me a moment. All right, can you hear me? Am I being heard by all the people who need to hear me? Okay. All right. So how is everyone tonight? Good. Good. Glad to hear it. I'm in the right place then. All right. So I'm honored to be here. I represent most of the East Side suburbs, including Cleveland Heights. I'm a former Cleveland Heights resident. I live in Euclid right now, born and raised in Euclid. My parents on my dad's side were public school teachers. Well, my parents were public school teachers. On my dad's side, they were public school teachers. On my mom's side, grandma worked at a jewelry store, and my grandfather was a foreman in a factory. And one of the great stories about my grandmother on my mother's side was she got in trouble one time for screeching the tires of a car as she sped through town square. So I come from a long line of rebel rousers. So today we're going to, I'm going to give you an update on Columbus. Well, I'm going to tell you some of the bad things that are going on in Columbus, to tell you some of the terrible things that are going on in DC. We're going to use an example from history to try to pull those two spaces of conflict together. We're going to take a look at the 2024 election and some of the lessons we can learn from it. We're going to talk about some resistance strategies, and we're going to answer the question, two questions: should we have any hope? And who saved abortion rights? So I am going to be bound to notes because I'm going to try to cover a lot. I'm going to try to be respectful of your time, but I am going to try to fly through this. Now, the Columbus and DC segments are the longest of this. So when I get to the end of it, don't be like, oh my God, he's going to be here until next week. Because I'm not. But we are going to cover a lot. Really quick, I want to give you a little bit of what my background is, what inspired me to try to change the world through government service. I'm not from wealth. I'm not from a political family. Essentially, I've been motivated most of my life by the phrase, well, that ain't right. And the first time I said that was sort of middle school when I learned about the Civil Rights Movement. Because learning about the Civil Rights Movement, I kind of discovered that government can be the problem and government can be the solution. And so that sort of, spurred my activism at a young age. And, then I ran a fair housing agency in the city of Euclid in the late 1900s, the very end of the century, actually. And it was during that time, as I was doing community organizing, I discovered something called predatory lending. And the subprime industry was taking hold, and through deceitful loan practices was robbing people of lifetimes of home equity. And I began sounding the alarm about it. And my master's degree research was on the emerging threat of subprime lending. And I actually walked that research down to Policy Matters Ohio, and I'm a co-author on their very first foreclosure report that they published probably in 2001. And that research got me recruited into the PhD program for economic development at Cleveland State. Again, I sort of saw something and I said, well, that ain't right. And I tried to do something about it. I ran for the school board in 2001 in Euclid because at that point, the state had begun sort of a testing program, and Euclid's test scores were not where they thought they would be. And the city council of Euclid began blaming the schools for everything else that the city couldn't get done. And I sort of took a look at the horizon at that point. I realized that our enrollment was up, but we'd closed elementary schools years ago. And so I ran in 2001 on a pro-education agenda, and basically my philosophy was we need to reopen these elementary schools. There's research that indicates that high poverty populations do better in small class sizes. We need to reopen buildings. The incumbents all ran as a slate against me, and I beat them all, including a person who'd never been beaten in the city of Euclid before, whose last name was DeWine. Yes, I paused for dramatic effect. Practice this story. But it took me my entire first term, but we finally got that plan in place. So in 2005, I ran for re-election with a levy on the ballot to reopen elementary schools, and I made the promise to the city of Euclid residents. I said, if you re-elect me and you pass this levy, I guarantee our test scores will improve, or else I won't run again in 2009. And people were just jaw-drop shocked that anyone would take responsibility for anything. But I got re-elected, the levy passed, and then 1 year later our test scores were up where they needed to be. And again, I was motivated by the phrase, well, that ain't right. But as I served in the Euclid School Board, I realized most of the problems that our district was dealing with were coming from a gaping hole 2 hours south, which was the Columbus General Assembly, the Ohio General Assembly in Columbus. So I ran for State House in 2014, been reelected in 16, 18, and 20, ran for the State Senate in 2022. I'm up for reelection in 2026. Let me conclude a thought on 2022. In 2022, the GOP and dark money interests found somebody to run against me in the primary because this is a very blue seat. Republicans are not going to win this in November. And that individual was financed by school choice advocates and Americans for Prosperity. And we beat them 61-38 percentage-wise. So I've beaten the Koch brothers. And as you may know, the filing deadline for my re-election effort is in about 4 weeks. And there's somebody on the ballot challenging me again in the Democratic space. Now, filing deadline is February. Maybe they'll file, maybe they won't. But we've sort of seen this happen before. So with that, I would politely encourage you, if possible, if you live in the 21st Senate District, to be on the lookout for flyers in your mailbox from Americans for Prosperity, and we'll just see how the 2026 campaign unfolds. I will say that this is a dangerous precedent, because if Americans for Prosperity are able to win seats in Democratic primaries, then this will be their tactic in blue districts moving forward. If we can beat them, and we did in 2022, if this is the strategy again in 2026, we need to do that, because if not, every open seat will soon have a Democrat in name only running being financed by dark money. So let me leave it at that. And with that, I'm going to roll into the remarks. I'm going to lead off with two quotes that came days apart from each other in the summer of 2024. First quote, and you might have some affinity to this. The quote is, "American democracy asks the hardest of things, to believe that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. So democracy begins with us. It begins when one person decides there is something more important than themselves, when they decide that their country matters more than they do." Second quote, "The cynics will tell you that one vote doesn't change anything, but what they don't tell you is nothing can change without a vote. Change isn't up to the cynics, change is up to us." Okay, so the first quote, Joe Biden at the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And days later, the second quote, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in a video she posted. So listen, friends, you need to know, Columbus is a 4-alarm fire right now. But DC is a 5-alarm fire. In DC, it's all about grift, and in Columbus, it's a dishonest shell game. We're going to cover some of the terrible things that have been done by State House Republicans. Specifically, we're going to cover 12 of them. Again, I'm going to try to move fairly quickly. Then we're going to talk about what's going on in DC. The first thing that needs to be said about the Columbus State House Republicans is they've given another tax cut to the wealthiest of Ohioans. In fact, if you're not earning over $100,000, you're not going to get anything from this latest tax cut. This year's tax cut to millionaires was after multiple tax cuts to the highest income earners over the last 20 years. It's to the point where the Ohio Children's Budget estimated that the top 1% of income earners in the state of Ohio are paying $52,000 less in income tax than they did 20 years ago. And what the tax cuts have created is a K-shaped economy. So that, K, top 10% doing better, bottom 90% doing worse. The GOP is dedicated to making the comfortable more comfortable and the afflicted more afflicted. Ohio's median household income has not been above the national average since 2003. We have the 5th highest unemployment of all the 50 states. 1/3 of the state qualifies for federal food assistance. 1.5 million Ohioans rely on SNAP benefits. 40% can't make ends meet. That is not a left-wing stat. That is from the very, socially accepted Greater Cleveland United Way and their ALICE report. ALICE is one of the best acronyms in public life. It is Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. It is literally a report about the working poor. And again, according to the latest ALICE report, 40% of the state can't make ends meet. Half of the Ohio public school kids are economically disadvantaged. So says the Fordham Institute, which is a right-leaning education group based in Columbus. And part of the problem is that the things that we can't shop for are the prices that keep going up. Healthcare, utilities, housing, rent. There's a report that came out that says that rent has gone up 50% since the beginning of the pandemic. And let me give you 2 of the most disturbing stats that I've seen. Again, forgive me, PhD studies in economic development. I'm essentially a frustrated PhD student in the legislature. This is the role that I play. The National Association of Realtors has been keeping track of the median age of first-time home purchase. They started keeping track of that data in 1981. 1981, the average age for initial home purchase was 29. In 2024, that age was 38. That's a huge problem. That's 10 years of you're not building equity. That's 10 years that if you've got a 30-year note, you've got to work 10 years longer. I mean, that ripple effect is profound. And the 2 major purchases for most people are home, auto. Guess what research we found just this week? Average age of a vehicle driving around on American streets these days, 13 years old, which is the oldest it's ever been. So again, people are not getting ahead. The American dream is getting more and more out of reach, and it's because we're dedicated to making the wealthy more wealthy. Second most terrible thing, this is not in order, by the way. Senate Bill 1, the Ohio Education Destruction Act. The only thing that was wrong with Ohio public universities was the cost. Did the Republicans do anything about that? No, instead they saddled state schools with new unfunded mandates, the loss of academic freedom. The outcome will be less Ohio kids will go to college in the state, which means less out-of-state students will also come to Ohio, and top-tier professors will not teach here. If you've lost academic freedom, they have 49 other states to choose from. Senate Bill 1 and the Republican attacks on higher education will set our future back. Number 3, Republicans continue to attack unions. Thanks to the GOP, university professors cannot strike. It's important to keep in mind that faculty working conditions are student learning conditions. Who's next? Collective bargaining and the ability for workers to organize helps turn a minimum wage into a living wage. The GOP has also introduced legislation to get rid of prevailing wage, project labor agreements, and make Ohio a right-to-work state. Research says where unions are strong, jobs are safer, and wages are higher. Number 4, Republicans continue to disrespect voters, and most recently you can see that with the legislation on marijuana. Voters made it legal, but the Ohio GOP is rolling back the freedoms you voted for in 2023. The GOP likes freedom as long as they can define what your freedom is. So the new marijuana prohibitions are the most recent example of GOP overreach and do not respect Ohioans. One of the things that's important about the marijuana vote, which was issue 2 in November of 2023, is there's 33 state Senate districts in the state of Ohio. Issue 2 passed in 30 out of the 33 state Senate districts. This was not a small, victory by any stretch. The GOP also doesn't like new things, which is one of the reasons why they've cut library funding. Ohioans visited their libraries over 44 million times. Our library visitation is the second highest in the nation, behind only Wyoming, and nobody lives in Wyoming, so I don't think we should count it. We visited libraries 44 million times in 2023, and that makes Republicans nervous because libraries contain knowledge, which can lead to ideas, which can lead to change, and the GOP likes things the way they are. State House Republicans fail to realize that library shelves full of diverse selections are a sign of a healthy society. So cutting library funding is bad for Ohio's future. Number 6, speaking of cutting funding, a fully funded education system helps every child reach their full potential so they can achieve their own blessings of liberty and live a full life. But the GOP doesn't want every child to reach its potential. They want, and this is important, an obedient workforce of gig workers who earn little and demand less. The Ohio Legislature has not done its constitutional duty to fully fund a K-12 education system. Ohio kids can do anything, they can become anything, so we should let them, and we do that through funding K-12 education, which 88% of Ohio kids go to the public schools. Which leads to another child-oriented policy that I would say is bad for the state, which is the GOP wants to expand child labor. Even Mike DeWine thought this was a bad idea, which makes me giggle when I read it. The GOP wants 14-year-olds working at fast food restaurants on school nights. Republicans are trying to steal adolescents so they can still get their extra value meal after 9 p.m. The GOP also continues to want to try to steal your health care. We had a huge fight in the budget because the governors and the GOP inserted one word into the budget which would require the state to end all affordable care subsidies if DC reduced federal funding by even a dime. That word was shall. So it said in the budget, if DC cuts federal funding for the Affordable Care Act, Ohio shall discontinue its proportional share. We fought to get shall replaced with may, and we lost. So if DC cuts any of their funding, according to the budget that was passed by Republicans, 770,000 Ohioans will lose their health care. Losing health care is not cost reduction, it's not saving things, it's not reform, it's a public health care disaster. The GOP also admitted that they wrote deceitful ballot language to stop redistricting reform in the issue that failed in 2024. And we know this because the chairman of the Ohio Republican Party said so at a meeting like this in February of 2025. He said, words to the effect of, so we tried to confuse people. Did you hear people saying they were confused by issue 1? Wasn't this a good idea that we confuse people? He literally said this at a meeting. Thank God there was a local reporter there who took down what he said and published it. So if you don't think that the vote's going a certain way, maybe you should, I don't know, change your policy as opposed to try to confuse voters. And this guy's the leader of a state political party, and he actually admitted that the goal was confusion, and somehow this was a laudable accomplishment. So yeah, if you're trying to steal someone's vote, you're essentially trying to steal their dreams. One of the worst things, and again, this is number 10 of the 12, is one of the worst things that happened in the budget was we gave $600 million to the billionaire owners of the worst football team in the last 25 years. Since coming back in 1999, the Browns franchise has made 3 playoff appearances, 2002, 2020, and 2023. And they just fired the coach that had 2 of those 3. All of those were on the road, which means the current stadium, Huntington Bank Field, is the only NFL venue that has never hosted a postseason game of any kind. So just kind of ask the question, was that worth $600 million? The Ohio GOP also is passing voter suppression tactics and policies. Stealing your vote will silence your voice, which will lead to a government which will ruin your life. Listen to me, Ohio's bad politicians are elected when good people don't vote. Don't let them steal your vote. Don't let them steal the midterms. There'll be more on this topic later in my address. Another way that Republicans stole your money was through their property tax shell game. For example, the average home in Huntington Valley costs $1.9 million. They are going to get property tax relief. Will you? Question mark. Look, the best takedown of the collection of bills that were the property tax relief legislation that the GOP put forward came from one of their own. And I'm going to read you something in a second, but I need to give you the context. So the property tax reform fight began in the House, came over to the Senate. It came through local government committee, where I'm the ranking Democrat. So I heard all of these bills, I heard all of the testimony, and we had over 20 amendments to the bills that were, I think only one was accepted in committee. We then had a huge floor fight on the Senate floor where we offered about 12 amendments. And we lost all of those fights. And then Senator Bill Blessing, a suburban Republican from Cincinnati, stood up and gave this amazing speech. And I'm going to read part of it to you now. These are his words. So Blessing, it's about, he probably had the mic for about 15, 20 minutes. And I'm going to pick it up now. He says, I could go on, which gives you an indication how long he'd been going. But you get the picture. I believe the net effect of what we're doing today will be the following, and he then proceeds to make 7 predictions about these bills. He says, first, we're going to see an increase in the number of levies over the coming years, accelerating as cash reserves are spent down and any state emergency temporary support dries up. Second, we will see more districts in fiscal watch and fiscal emergency. When it becomes harder to raise local revenue, this is the likely result. Third, local governments and school districts will direct their ire at the state when they go to the ballot. Fourth, bond ratings for local governments and school districts will go down, which will lead to increased borrowing costs. Fifth, services will almost certainly be cut if levies fail to pass. Sixth, the electorate is likely to be underwhelmed by these changes. They do not amount to immediate tax relief, and they may very well still be angry after the fact. Seventh, what happened to simplicity? This definitely complicates the property tax system. And he sort of concluded this section with this. If all of this is correct, what does a long-term fix look like? I really think it's as simple as boosting state-level school funding. Those are the words of Republican Senator Bill Blessing. And what he basically has said all along is, look, if the state does their share to fund public education, there's less of a need for property tax on the local end. So as we cut income tax and don't fund the Fair School Funding Plan, our policies are creating the problem that is now leading to the need for property tax relief. Let me give you some stats about the 10 states that surround Ohio. So I'm looking at the Great Lakes states, Minnesota and New York, the 2 southern states below us, Kentucky and West Virginia. So there's 10 states in total. Of those 10 states, Ohio has the 2nd highest property tax. We have the 4th highest sales tax, yet the lowest income tax for those on the high end of the income bracket. Our tax, nobody just pays property tax. You pay a version of all of those 3. The way to do this is to level out the 3 legs of the stool so no tax burden is excessive. We've completely screwed that up in Ohio and filed down 1 leg of the stool so the thing can't support itself. Okay, you ready for DC? All right, here we go. Wasn't that fun? No, I'm good. I do this all the time. The problem with American politics is the concentration of power. The problem with the American economy is the concentration of power. And Trump is trying to consolidate both for his benefit, not yours, not ours, his benefit. According to the Wall Street Journal, this was about a week ago, the Trump family fortune has increased by $4 billion in 2025. Some of the highlights. He proclaimed April 2025 to be Cancer Control Month after he cut cancer research funding earlier in the year. He ordered his Attorney General to take action against all state laws meant to prevent climate change from getting worse. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. He opened up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for natural resource development. He ended all offshore leases for the development of offshore wind farms. He He removed the United States from the United Nations Human Rights Council. He withdrew the United States from the World Health Organization. He put job-killing tariffs on every nation, even the ones that only were inhabited by penguins. Remember that? Except for 2. What were the 2 nations that did not get tariffs put on them? Russia? One more. Think beacon of democracy. North Korea. Right. He excluded transgender people from being able to serve in the American military. He banned diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the U.S. military. Tuskegee Airmen, anyone? He switched sides in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're now supporting the dictator and not the democracy. He signed an executive order to close the Department of Education. Before he ended the Department of Education, though, he ordered the Secretary of Education to develop a strategy to end the indoctrination strategy for the purposes of ending the introduction of un-American ideology in our K-12 classrooms. He ordered all federal museums and historic sites so that they will no longer be able to include ideological indoctrination, which means they will no longer acknowledge the different experiences that people of different races had in America. He shut the government down to try to end Obamacare and cut food stamp and SNAP funding to try to break the DC Democratic resistance. He ordered the United States will establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve and the United States digital asset pile, and of course he did so after he pardoned several crypto former executives. He established that March 9th would be known as U.S. Hostage and Wrongful Detainee Day, when his administration has admitted to detaining the wrong people. Speaking of which, he and his administration have ignored the core American rights of due process, the judicial branch of government altogether. And when the right people were detained, he let them out. Remember, on day 1, he commuted the sentences of those who were convicted of offenses, including those who pled guilty related to the January 6, 2021 attempted insurrection attempt. Others have received a full pardon. The Wall Street Journal also reported recently the cost of a pardon today seems to be $1 million. Speaking of law and order, he said he was fighting the war on drugs by invading Venezuela while blowing up boats and fishermen. All the while, he pardoned the former leader of Honduras, who was lawfully convicted of being a narco-dictator. Back on American soil, this administration is attempting to squelch dissent. Let's run through some things he did in order. In February, it removed the leadership of the Kennedy Center. In April, it ended funding for PBS and NPR. In May, he defunded the National Endowment of the Arts. In June, he got rid of the head of the National Portrait Gallery. In August, the Smithsonian, he banned and censored museum exhibits. And in December, he rebranded the Kennedy Center in his own name. Trump has gone after late-night television shows. And remember this, when CBS announced they would end Stephen Colbert's Late Show, at that time, Trump posted, "Kimmel was next." And we know what happened. This White House is attempting to reshape the rich cultural landscape of American artistic freedom into an obedient applause track. Let me remind you that individual freedom and artistic freedom walk together stride in stride. Artists, dancers, writers, actors, and musicians try to inspire the courage within us to conquer our own personal demons so that we will together build a world that we can all believe in and be proud of. The song of dissent needs to be sung, but it also needs to be heard so that others will find their voice when it matters most. And you sort of beat me to the punch with the applause. Because what I was going to say is, this is the only line of this talk that I'm going to repeat twice. Because I think this is critical. The song of dissent needs to be sung, but it also needs to be heard so that others will find their voice when it matters most. Thank you. And regarding his own political ambitions, remember he posted a photo of himself wearing a crown with the caption "King," and he is not ruled out running for a third term. Trump is trying to rig the 2026 congressional midterms because he fears losing power. Let me take you through a Trump-inspired timeline that led to one of Ohio's latest attacks on democracy. On August 18th, 2025, Trump posted a statement that began with, quote, "I'm going to lead a movement to get rid of mail-in ballots," unquote. Later in the same post, he wrote, "We are now the only country in the world that uses mail-in voting. All others gave it up because of massive voter fraud encountered." Those final three words in full caps. Guess what, Donald? Actually, according to a report from October, 34 nations still use some sort of postal voting, which is a number slightly larger than 0. But in response to Trump's demands, again, he makes that post August 18th. Less than 2 months later, Ohio Republicans in the Senate introduced Senate Bill 293 on October 14th, which immediately got fast-tracked, and 3 weeks later, on November 5th, it was passed by the Senate. This was, it did a variety of things, but one of the things that it did was it took the number of days for a legally, an absentee ballot postmarked ahead of the election, it took the grace period from 4 days down to 0. So if there's any delay at all, not due to the voter, but due to the Postal Service that Trump continues to bludgeon, if your ballot arrives after Election Day, it would not be counted. When that would have amounted to about just under 10,000 ballots across the state in the 2024. So we've covered dozens of things, both in Columbus and DC. Now I want to try to tie that all together. And I'm going to do so using a lesson from history. I want you to realize that that litany of things is sort of just like the Declaration of Independence. Because the conclusion of the Declaration of Independence essentially says it's all one fight. The Declaration lists 27 complaints against the King of England, but the action item essentially was, you cannot be trusted with power, and we will now take it from you. That's the real lesson from history today. The lesson is that all of these things are connected, but they do not want us to realize that. I think that statement was more true a year ago than it is now. But all of these things are connected. The same people who want to ban gender-affirming care for young people are the same people who are working to roll back abortion rights that the voters of this state put into our Constitution. These are the same people that have removed the ability for college professors to strike for better working conditions. These are the same people who tried to end majority rule, who wrote deceitful ballot language to stop the creation of fair legislative districts. These are the same people who want to end due process and birthright citizenship. These are the same people who would throw 770,000 Ohioans off their health care. These are the same people who have cut funding to food banks and libraries and public schools to try to keep Lake Erie clean while giving tax cuts to millionaires and $600 million to the owner of the Browns. It's the same group of people. And understanding that is critical so that we realize that these are not different fights. It is one fight, and it is the fight for the future of this state and the survival of this nation. And when we center that understanding, whatever the issue, that the outcome will impact us, all of us, then we can begin to bring the energy and determination and vigor and urgency to this fight because we are all impacted. Because our future will all be affected, and because we, working together, can create a better destiny, a better outcome, a better Ohio, and a better America. But to do that, we must realize that this is all one fight, and we must join it together. Now, okay. Thank you for that. Because that concludes that section of it. Now we're going to talk about what lessons have we learned from the 2024 election. Because by golly, we need to learn some lessons from the 2024 election. NBC News released a study mid-November 2024, a couple of weeks after the election. The results essentially were that Kamala won the informed vote, and she lost everything else. If you were an informed voter, you voted for Kamala Harris. If you were not an informed voter, you did not. And again, so that's a compelling piece of data and troubling. And then Pew Research came out with a study February 2025, where they tried to figure out more of that conclusion. And they concluded, they looked at social media and how voters make decisions, and they concluded that 20% of the public doesn't get, the voting public doesn't get their news from any sort of traditional source. And I realized reading the Pew Research study, and I'm going to go into it, that I am an uninformed voter. And I want to tell you what that means. So, as you heard in my introduction, I serve on 7 committees, and the question was even posed, is there a committee he doesn't serve on? And at times I feel that way. But, so I'm often in Columbus Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And when I come home Thursday night, I say to the lady friend, what did Trump do while I was gone? Because I don't know. I am buried in 7 committees. I'm fighting GOP things in Energy Committee, in Judiciary Committee, in Education Committee, and I am up to my eyeballs in this stuff. And frankly, that's what you as my constituents would hope, expect, etc. But yeah, I have no idea what's going on DC when I'm in Columbus. No idea. I'm the uninformed voter. There are people in the K-shaped economy whose car is over 13 years old, whose rent has increased 50% since the pandemic, whose utilities, healthcare, have all gone up. And they are working 1 or 2 jobs. They're working really hard. They've got kids in school. They are, doing the good parent thing. And they get the kids in bed and they turn on the internet to check on their friends because they've been buried all day. And as they're on the web, that's where they get their news. That's what the Pew Research study said. 20% is not, they're not trying to get it, they're being fed it. And they don't know that. So the good news in this, and the Pew study went on to say, they looked at news influencers, and they defined those as folks that have over 100,000 followers. They found out that the right wing was posting more often and more favorably about their candidate. Left-wing news influencers were not posting as much and were not as favorable to their candidate. 20% of the vote. Think about the margin. Trump beat Kamala in the popular vote by a smaller margin than Hillary beat Trump in 2016. This was a very close race decided in the swing states, but there's no mandate there. So here's the action item for you. Post more on the internet. Seriously, in your own words, with your own recollection. I'm not asking you to say, go say this. I'm saying you figure it out for yourself. Because all of us in this room are informed voters. But we've got friends that all know that we're informed voters. And what I mean by that is we all have friends that 3 days before Election Day call you and they say, what's this issue about? Because I don't know. They say, who should I vote for judge? You guys have an audience with the people who trust you, and you need to engage in them. You're not being annoying, you're reaching 20% of the voting public. So says those 2 studies. Okay, resistance strategies. We're coming around the bend. We're getting there. So I had the good fortune of hearing Cory Booker speak in Columbus in March of 2025. It was about 3 weeks before his filibuster. He did not tell us he was going to do that. But in the course of the discussion that Cory Booker had with us, he said a lot of things that then I heard on the Senate floor about 3 weeks later. And it was right after the Democrats had initially rolled on the healthcare debate and should there be a shutdown. And so Cory was getting a lot of flack from the audience about, what are Democrats doing and what should we do and this and that. And Cory Booker told this long story, which I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to tell you the punchline, because the punchline was amazing. As he told this long story, he basically demonstrated something that I will say then after I tell you the punchline. But the punchline was, he said, the only improper response is sedentary aggravation. Which is to say, the only improper response is lying on the couch and being angry and doing nothing. Because again, Cory told a story from his own past where little stuff matters. And somebody in his life did a little thing of resistance that led to a ripple effect that ended up helping Cory Booker live the life that he did. And it's an amazing story. I would also say that creativity matters. Resistance looks different in every circumstance. I had the good fortune of being able to go to Germany as a guest of the German government to talk about energy issues and what they were doing and what we're doing. And we got taken to a community just north of Bonn, and there was a national forest up there. I want to say it was called the Hambrick Forest, but I might have that name wrong. I actually wanted to look it up to make sure I got it right, but I forgot to do that. But the Hambrick Forest was being taken down essentially by a strip mining coal operation. And some people in Germany didn't want the Hambrick Forest to be taken down. But it was a government priority and they needed energy and blah, 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 and energy debates, etc. And so some people moved into the forest and they built tree houses in the forest. And I've got a poster in my state senate office that I brought back from Germany that's framed of a photo of 18 different tree houses. And it got enough national attention that it became an issue. And Germany had national government elections and the government flipped and the policy changed. And the forest still in part remains because people built tree houses. So perhaps we need to build tree houses. Perhaps we need to post more on the internet. But little stuff matters, and the only improper response is sedentary aggravation. So, final question. Well, second to last final question. Do I have any hope? Yes, 100%. Occasionally I get that, people will come up to me and they have this sad look in their eyes and they take my hand and they're like, oh, it must be horrible to be you. And I'm like, you maybe don't mean that the way it sounded. But they're like, yes. No, it must be horrible to have your job. I'm like, it's not quite horrible. But yeah, we get that. And they say, how can you go on with the fight in Columbus when you're so outnumbered? And my answer is, because we win more than we should. Because I've seen it happen. And so I want to give you 3 things to kind of conclude that give me hope. Because hopefully they'll give you hope also. Number 1, the results from 2025 are fairly clear, which is the Democratic vote is moving 13 percentage points on average in every race, in every type of community all across this nation. What's interesting is obviously we live in a gerrymandered state. On the congressional side of that currently leads to, even though we're a 55-45 state when they have their best day, leads to a 10-5 congressional delegation, which is 2/3, 1/3, which is not how Ohio votes. The most accurate congressional map would be 8-7. But if the vote is moving 13 percentage points, you know what's going to happen in the congressional delegation in Ohio? We're going to be an 8-7 state. Because the 5 Democrats, including Marcy Kaptur, who is a unicorn, by the way, and cannot be beaten. Marcy Kaptur will win, Greg Landsman will win, Amelia Sykes will win, Chantel Brown will win, Joyce Beatty will win. And the 2 Republicans that are below the 13-point threshold are Max Miller, who's at 7 points, and Mike Turner, who's in Dayton, who's at 10 points. Right on the edge is Mike Carey, who's sort of suburban Columbus, who's at 15 points. We win 2 of those seats, it's 8-7 Republican majority. We win 3 of those seats, it's 8-7 Democratic majority. So one of the things that we saw in the state Senate, and we are the most gerrymandered legislature among all of them in Ohio. For example, the Sherrod Brown-Bernie Moreno race was essentially a 50-50 race. If you look at it by who won state Senate districts, and again, there's 33 of them, it would have been 21-12. Bernie wins 21, Sherrod only wins 12 in a 50-50 race. That's how gerrymandered the state Senate is. But what's interesting is in the 2024 election cycle, we actually picked up seats in the Democratic side. because we're not a 75-25 state. You can't draw districts so unfair that they will hold. We actually went from 7, which is the lowest we'd ever been, to 9 in a year where we won no statewide races. So again, an 8-7 map is possible with the current move. The other thing is, there is apparently a US Senate race taking shape here in Ohio. That's what I've heard. Again, I'm an uninformed voter. We've covered that. I'm not on top of all this stuff. But Sherrod Brown is up against John Husted. There's something else that's supposed to start in January, which is the first energy trial in federal court, which the two executives who masterminded the takeover of the Ohio Legislature and the bribery of, among other people, the head of the watchdog agency, the PUCO, Michael Dowling and Chuck Jones, those two individuals are on trial. I am the ranking Democrat on the Senate Energy Committee. In the House, I was the ranking Democrat on the Public Utilities Committee. I could do 45 minutes on First Energy right now. I won't. But in the deferred prosecution agreement that First Energy signed with the U.S. Attorney's Office, about a 52-page document, on like page 37 or 39, there's something that First Energy has signed off on as being true. And it is a text between Michael Dowling and Chuck Jones. And the text says, and they're talking about the plot to install Sam Randazzo as the double agent, as the head of the PUCO. So First Energy has bribed Sam Randazzo. They need Mike DeWine to appoint him. And then there's a Senate confirmation, which in Ohio means nothing. It's ceremonial, especially when the Democrats are in the minority. I mean, Republicans are going to vote for it. But so in talking about, so they've bribed, at this point, they've bribed Sam Randazzo, and they said they're going to get DeWine to appoint him. So there's a text in the deferred prosecution agreement, and the text says, quote, 4 people in DeWine world, you, Sam, and I know about this. This is Dowling texting Jones. You, Sam, and I, that's Sam Randazzo, Michael Dowling, Chuck Jones. Who are the 4 people in DeWine world? I'll tell you who 3 of them are. Mike DeWine. Laurel Dawson. Laurel Dawson was Mike DeWine's chief of staff at the time. Sam Randazzo, as we found out in documents, Sam Randazzo had loaned the Dawson family $10,000 a few years prior. So she's probably good on this. 3rd person, John Husted. John Husted's running against Sherrod Brown in 2026. I would just love it if somehow, during the course of courtroom testimony, we found out who the 4 people in DeWine world who knew about the scheme before it took place. And the potential ripple effects of that from an electoral standpoint could be devastating to your current junior senator in Ohio. So that's the second thing that gives me hope. The third thing that gives me hope, and again, this is sort of the conclusion, but this is also a bit of a longer story. We're going to need you to hang on for this one, is the answer to the question, who saved abortion rights? The answer to that is everybody in Ohio. Everybody. So let's take you through the timeline, and I will explain how little stuff matters and protest matters. The Dobbs decision took place June 24th, 2022. 6-week abortion ban follows in Ohio about a week later. And with that, and we all remember it, there began, kind of the process of, okay, how do we put this into the state constitution? And you saw activist groups coming together, working on ballot language, et cetera, et cetera. The 2 doctors who led that effort live in my state Senate district. I'm very proud to have their support. But as you saw that happening, you also saw the other side, also trying to mobilize and try to come up with a strategy to prevent Ohioans from being able to restore their reproductive rights in the Ohio Constitution. And do you remember that State Representative Brian Stewart and Frank LaRose, defender of democracy Frank LaRose, introduced Senate Joint Resolution 6, to put on the ballot, because the legislature can put things on the ballot, an effort to change how citizens can amend the Constitution, taking it from 50% to 60%. So that is going on in the fall and winter of 2022, which is the conclusion of the legislative calendar. Because we've had elections in 22, those folks will get, like me, they get sworn in 23. So I'm in the Ohio House. This is the lame duck period. And what the Republicans needed to do is they needed a 60% vote. They'd already gotten it in the Senate. They needed a 60% vote of the Ohio House to put this on the ballot in May of 2023. Because they needed to put it on the ballot in May because the abortion vote was going to be in November. So if they can change the rules in May, they can prevent the win in November. But you're running out of time. Bob Cupp, the Speaker of the House, had it with his caucus. And he's like, we're going on December 14th, Tuesday, December 14th, and we're going on Wednesday, December 15th, and we're done. And when he says that, he can't really take it back, because then people start making holiday plans, and they start, so he can't be like, oh, we got to come back, because literally, like, a third of the chamber will be like gone. So you can't really change that. So that was a solid ending. But what happened those 2 days when they were going to bring up House Joint Resolution, or is it Senate Joint Resolution? House Joint Resolution 6 was protesters showed up. And they filled the House gallery on Tuesday, December 14th. And they were loud, and they had signs, and they were boisterous, and eventually they all got thrown out of the chamber. And you know what? They didn't bring up House Joint Resolution 6 on that day. And Brian Stewart, God bless him, kind of the way that, they say that in Texas, wrote a memo right after that to all GOP House members. In light of yesterday's temper tantrum from the left in the House chamber, I wanted to write you again regarding House Joint Resolution 6. The old saying in the military is, if you're taking flak, you're over the target. The reason the far left group in Ohio is fighting so hard to preserve their ability to do an end run around us, the elected representatives of the people, to amend the Ohio Constitution by a bare 50% plus one, and he lists two reasons. And the first one is abortion, and the second one is redistricting. And what's great about this memo is it got leaked to the press. Oh, too bad, right. And with that, everybody knew the game plan. And so we head into the final legislative day of the year, Wednesday, December 15th. And I said in the House Democratic Caucus, I said, the citizens of Ohio saved us yesterday. We need to save them today. And with that began the longest legislative day that anyone remembers in the Ohio House of Representatives. And the Republicans brought up a variety of issues, and we fought them every way. It's how, floor speech, and we were just trying to run out the clock. We didn't know what was going to happen, but we were fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. And lo and behold, members of their caucus began to leave. At like 9 o'clock, you start seeing some of them drift off. 11 o'clock, you start seeing some of them drift off. And House Joint Resolution came up for a vote around 1 a.m. We went until 6:15 in the morning. Longest legislative day in any, it's not like anybody keeps track of this, but there was a bunch of people that had been around for a while, and they're like, we've never seen anything like this. About 1 a.m., they bring up House Joint Resolution 6, and it passes, but it doesn't have 60% of the vote. So we lost, but we won. So that means it's not going to be on the May ballot in 2023. So we come back for the next General Assembly, and they've got a very small window to get it passed. It's got to be like early February, and they just don't have enough time. So then you might remember, even though they banned August special elections, that was one of the things we did. That was one of the things we did in the final 2 days. they then passed a new law saying, oh, but we can bring back August special elections. And what's amazing is they introduced the bill before the other one had even taken effect. So we have a rip-roaring time with this as the Senate Democratic resistance, as the House Democratic resistance. But here's the other thing. As it passes. We fight it, but it passes. But, and this is what I want you to keep in mind, the first 6 months of the odd year is when we have to pass the budget. So there is a ton of things going on, and the budget's very complicated, and there's other bills and other things are going on, and blah, 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 and it's just, and the State House Press Corps is really good. Before the pandemic, they were terrible. After the pandemic and Trump started saying that the press was the enemy of the people, State House Press Corps is now amazing, but they couldn't cover it all. So we get to July 1st, we pass the budget, and everybody goes home, but we've got this August election in 2023. And you know what the State House Press Corps did? They started writing one story over and over and over again for 5 weeks. And as you might remember, every former Ohio governor came out opposed to changing the Constitution. Every former Ohio Attorney General came out opposed to changing the Constitution. And it was because the State House Press Corps could tell the story to the uninformed voter over and over and over again for 5 weeks. And so the conclusion of my talk is little things matter, is resistance matters, because you all showed up and got thrown out of the Ohio House Gallery on Tuesday, December 14th. Brian Stewart writes a memo, gets leaked to the press. Republicans leave during the longest floor debate in State House history. They don't get to be able to put it on in May, and they have to put it on in August. Because if they would have put it on in May, there would not have been the attention paid to it, because the State House Press Corps was covering everything else. But because they have to put it on in August, it goes down in flames, and reproductive rights are restored in November because of little acts of resistance from people like you. So don't tell me, that your creative bits of resistance don't matter, because I've seen it work with my own eyes. And the quote that I want to leave you with, going back to the Declaration of Independence, is Benjamin Franklin said, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Thank you very much.
Senator Smith has agreed to take questions for maybe 10 minutes or so, and my colleague Patrice will walk around and take questions, and she will hold on to the mic and you can ask the questions.
Yeah, it's your meeting. I'll stay as long as you want. I realize, however, people are probably baking pies and stuff.
We might be here till midnight.
Okay.
All right, so this is the way we're going to do it. If you raise your hand, I will make my way to you. Please do not ask Senator Smith any questions without the microphone. I will hold on to the microphone. It seems unnatural for you, but the sound is much better at that point. So I'm going to walk around and meet our first hands up over here.
Thank you so much. Senator Smith, thank you so much for your service, which is absolutely critical. And I wish I had a fraction of your energy. And that fire hose of information is incredibly sobering and informative. And I wonder if you may also have any thoughts about Senator Moreno is trying to push through a bill to strip 40+ million Americans of dual citizenship rights. And if you have any information or thoughts on that, I would appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for your question. So it's unconstitutional. You know, it's kind of how I'm going to start. And I would think that it then gets laughed off. But that's just not the case in the current environment in DC. I will tell you off camera how I'm affected personally by that bill. If you look at Project 2025, it's a 900-page takedown of the federal government by sort of cabinet level. And they're running that game plan right now. It is a playbook. But what's interesting is, and what's disturbing is, the one branch of federal government that's not covered in Project 2025 is the US Supreme Court. Because you do not need to take over what is already compliant. So I'm very nervous about the erosion of what is blatantly in our Constitution with the current majority of the US Supreme Court. And I go back to the Dred Scott decision and the reaction of Frederick Douglass. So Dred Scott decision happens in, 1850s. Frederick Douglass rightfully loses his mind. But because that decision was so heinous and so wrong at its core and so against what the purpose of the revolution was for, which was only 80 years old at that point. As the Dred Scott decision happens and Frederick Douglass embodies the resistance against that decision, the shocking thing that happens is the Emancipation Proclamation within 10 years. So, if we are to lose core constitutional rights, and we might, the resistance is critical. But the Dred Scott decision and the resistance that arose should be the roadmap that we should all follow so that it further enrages us, it further engages us so that we will win the long game and America will be better as a result.
Hi, Senator Smith. What is the name of the Christian nationalist group that is having so much influence on our legislature? Why is it so influential, and what can we do to counter them?
It's the Center for Christian Virtue. I'll have you know that Brian Stewart makes mention of them in his memo, saying that House Joint Resolution I'm reading now, House Joint Resolution 6 is supported by the Ohio Right to Life and, the Center for Christian Virtue. He then proceeds to list two other organizations that disavowed their support after this was leaked to the public. But those two organizations did not disavow their support. It's a part of the far-right coalition. They're the folks who, again, define freedom the way that they want freedom defined. They're the folks who are behind censorship. They're the folks that are, fighting gender-affirming care. They want the Constitution to be in every classroom. I'm sorry, the Ten Commandments to be in every classroom. They're probably opposed to that. The way that, we've got to have redistricting reform to get a more balanced legislature. And the way you do that under the current Constitution is you've got to win 2 of 3 executive positions in Ohio state government. You have to win the governor, secretary of state, and the state auditor. Because the current redistricting commission is 2 members of each legislative party from each chamber and those 3 positions. And those 7 individuals will draw the map. And so we have got to win 2 of those 3. Governor, currently Vivek versus Amy Acton. Secretary of State, I think Robert Sprague is the Republican nominee. He's the current treasurer against Allison Russo and Brian Hamley. State auditor, the Annette Blackwell of Mayor Maple Heights has just announced that she would be the Democratic nominee. I think LaRose is running for auditor. Boy, it'd be really terrible if he lost. One of the advantages of Frank LaRose being in office is he's really dumb, and he hires dumb people because he doesn't want to be outshined. And so they've been just a wealth of wonderful quotes and stuff. So I'm going to be that sad to see Frank go, but it'd probably be better for the state if he did. Center for Christian Virtue is a part of, the worst things that are happening in Columbus. And the best thing that could happen is if we would get a legislature that would respect the will of the voters, and we can do that through redistricting reform. Hi, Pat.
Just wanted to add one thing to that. You mentioned Allison Russo, but not her Democratic opponent.
I thought I did. I did.
Okay, if you did, I didn't hear it. My hearing isn't what it used to be, and I apologize. I would like to hear your current position on the ability of American citizens to criticize foreign governments without repercussion.
Well, I mean, it's, again, freedom of speech is in the First Amendment. It's the first for, I think it was first intentionally, and, those rights are being eroded by the current government. So, as in the same way that I said, the Supreme Court is we cannot count on the Supreme Court to defend the basic constitutional rights that have been guaranteed for citizens for 250 years. I think we should be cognizant of, that the notion that they might go away. Again, I had a whole section of the talk on the attacks on how the administration is attempting to squelch dissent. And I think those attacks are very real, and I think they will get worse before they get better.
I'd just like to remind you of your vote on the Senate bill that fortunately did not pass in the House, trying to restrict Americans' ability to criticize Israel without repercussions.
So that was in the previous administration, and there was not an attack on the First Amendment during the Biden administration. If you in any way think Joe Biden's approach to the First Amendment and Donald Trump's approach to the First Amendment are the same, I would ask you to perhaps do a Google search.
So you haven't mentioned ICE or immigration, and you had a great list of all the things. To me, that's one of the more horrifying things going on right now, because he's building a national police force that's only accountable to him, and they're using attacking immigrants as the spear. And there's so much money being poured into it, more now, thanks to that big ugly bill. So I wonder if you want to just share your thoughts on that, especially in light of what just happened in Minneapolis.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to go back to a little bit of, I'm an uninformed voter. I concentrate on Columbus. I gave you a good list of reasons that we should fear the Trump administration. I will say that I've recently read a book called 3 Ordinary Girls, which is a story of 3 teenage girls in the Netherlands after the Nazis take over the country. I would remind you that Anne Frank was in hiding in the Netherlands. And these 3 girls do amazing things. They become spies, saboteurs, and assassins. I am not encouraging that behavior among the current members of the audience, but that was a very, interesting time. But one of the things that I was reminded of as I read that book was that the Nazi government nationalized the police force. And so I'm very concerned about ICE. I did mention in the talk that the Trump administration is abandoning due process. And I mean, that's essentially what, these on-street kidnappings are. And again, the worst among us deserves a trial by their peers. And again, it's hard for me to read the Constitution and not, come to that conclusion. And the notion that the Supreme Court is green-lighting some of this stuff. I mean, the Supreme Court decision to grant presidential immunity is on par with Dred Scott. It's on par with Plessy versus Ferguson. And I would remind you that in Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the Supreme Court decision that led to Jim Crow, legally led to Jim Crow, that separate but equal would be legally allowed, that there was one dissenting opinion, and it was John Harlan. So that was an 8-1 decision. But the John Harlan decision is one of the most amazing, the dissent is one of the most amazing documents in American history, where he says, there is no caste here. And the rights of the Constitution are to be equally shared among wealthy and poor and white and black. So, yes, I'm troubled by ICE also.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you for being here tonight.
Sure.
And I want to thank you for your encouragement of creative activism. It's inspiring and encouraging. I'm on the Arts Committee, so it's got me thinking already. And I also, you've talked a lot about social media and sharing. If you aren't already following him on social media, do so, because his weekly updates are amazing and they're really easy to repost.
Yes.
My question to you is kind of an odd one. I'm not even quite sure how to word it, but we don't get to walk around with the powers that be in the State House. So I'm wondering what your assessment is, your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Are they truly ideologically dedicated to these laws they're trying to pass? Or are they really just sort of manipulating an uninformed voting group to stay in power, and they don't really believe half the stuff they're doing?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I've already broken one of the rules of public speaking, which is to say in Q&A you never say that's a really good question, because you've just insulted everybody else who's asked the question. So that is a very insightful question. So here's how I would answer that. We have term limits in Ohio. I got elected to the State House in 2014 and began trying to sort of do a diagnosis of the majority party. And, and they actually they all sort of look the same, which is very interesting. So the 2014 class looked a certain way, the 2016 class looked a certain way, 2018 class looked a certain way, but the 2020 class was different. And what I realized was, because of term limits, the folks who got elected in 14, 16, 18 were inspired to be in government service by people like George W. Bush, by people like John Kasich. And so I wasn't really thrilled with this group of people, but they were at least rooted in fact. Seriously. And the class of 2020 had been inspired to run by Trump. And that was the pivot that I saw. And I remember seeing, and I figured this out in April, so 4 months in, I'm like, what's different with this group? And light bulb goes on in April. And I saw Kirk Shearing, who was a Republican senator from Canton, walking on the street. And I went up to him and I'm like, Kirk, what's with this bunch? And he's like, I know. But Kirk Shearing had been elected, previously. And again, the group that came in 22, the group that came in 24, still inspired by Trump. So yeah, we've got to take back the country, but we need to hope that the Republican Party at some point pivots. Obviously that's not, even if you read my job description, that's not even, in the other assigned duties category, that's my responsibility. But yeah, and so the difference is The Senate, you often sort of graduate from the House and go to the Senate. So the Senate is a much more reasonable group because, again, they sort of joined the legislature in, the 14, 16, and even 12 and 10 class. But yeah, and I will say this, I think term limits are a good thing because I've seen term limits remove bad legislators from the General Assembly when voters would not. And my general feeling is that if you're a good legislator, you'll find a way to stay engaged. I've seen good ones still have their influence felt. So I realize I'm probably in the minority on that, but I think term limits are a good thing. And this is one of those cases where if we can transition the figurehead of the GOP, and maybe we can, again, if you ask Frederick Douglass in 1858, how do you think America's going to wind up? He's probably got a different answer than if you ask him that, in 1868. But term limits give us the ability to transition leadership.
Yeah, what's going on with our Great Lakes and Lake Erie? How protected is it going to be in the future? And if good old Ramaswamy gets in, what will we do?
Yeah, so there's a variety of challenges with the Great Lakes, but most of them are federal. Water, thanks to the Toledo water crisis, which occurred, I think, summer of 14, where Ohio's fourth largest city, because of algae blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie, shut down the water system for the fourth largest city in Ohio. Thankfully, that only Democrats weren't affected by that. Republicans were affected by that also. So John Kasich did a few good things. That is a very small list. But one of the things that he did was he brought agriculture and water interests to the table and got those interests to come together to realize that if you shut off the water system, that's bad for everybody. And most of the phosphorus, it was coming from the Maumee River Basin, which is fed through industrial farms in Indiana and northwestern Ohio. All of that is to say, Ohio is actually probably the leader among the Great Lakes states for an example of state collaboration. The problem is Trump and the DC Republicans have much more influence over the amount of money that can come in to clean up the areas of concern, which is an actual acronym. We have AOC in a different context, but areas of concern is in the water context has led to some really amazing things. Ashtabula has been an area of concern that's gotten a lot of investment. Erie, PA is an area of concern that's got a lot of investment. So I'm concerned about the Great Lakes. The good news is there really is some strong bipartisan support for it, even among the Republicans that represent Great Lakes states in DC, but Trump is not beholden to the Great Lakes, and that's my concern.
We are going to shut this evening down. It's about 8:30. We're heading into the bewitching hour. I want to thank everybody that came out tonight, and I do want to remind you that on February 4th, we're going to be celebrating our first anniversary. It's going to be fun. There might be some dancing. There will be some cake. Yeah, exactly. Let's make it fun. Let's get to know each other on a social level and really celebrate everything that we have done so far. So I want to thank you very much, Senator Smith,